Hi everyone, it's been a 007 here for a mini-pod in our Agatha Christie reread. This is episode 59 and we are covering By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which is the first Tommy and Tuppence novel in quite some time. It was originally published in November 1968. As always, we will be spoiler-free until the end credits music. This is a novel that comes after Endless Night, published in 1967, which was a sort of romance thriller without one of the classic lead detectives of Agatha Christie in it. And it comes before the Hercule Poirot mystery Halloween Party. And as I said, this is only the third of the Tommy and Tuppence novels, and they are the only detectives who are allowed to age. So they are now middle-aged in this work. We first met them as young adventurers in their 20s. And the title of this book comes from Act 4, Scene 1 of Shakespeare's Macbeth, when the second witch says, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes," which I think speaks to something elementally wicked and maybe is of itself a clue as to the nature of the murderer here. Because so often in Agatha Christie, murders are murders of opportunity or covetousness. People want money or there's a sexual motive. But sometimes, Agatha Christie is a religious woman and she does believe that evil exists, and sometimes evil is the motivation all by itself. So it's an interesting book. It's actually presented to us in three parts, which follow the adventures mostly of Tuppence here. They're not adventuring together. I think there's some resentment on the part of Tuppence that she's an elderly woman now. Her children are grown and have their own careers and families and children. And where Tommy still is allowed to be on the fringes of exciting intelligence work, Tuppence is a little bit put out to pasture. So really this is a book that's following her investigations. It all starts when Tommy and Tuppence visit Tommy's Aunt Ada in a retirement home called Sunny Ridge. And Aunt Ada is an old battle axe, and this leaves Tuppence to her own devices because Ada doesn't really want to spend time with Tuppence. So she goes to the sort of nursing homes lounge area and meets another resident called Mrs Lancaster, who really is rather spooky, and says at one point to Tuppence, "Was it your poor child there behind the fireplace?" Now, a few weeks later, Aunt Ada dies of natural causes, we suppose, and so Tommy and Tuppence have to go back to the funeral home, and they realise that Mrs Lancaster, this spooky old lady, has been spirited away by the mysterious Mrs Johnson. But actually, Mrs Lancaster had left a painting to Aunt Ada. And Tuppence kind of is pretending to be all earnest and, oh, maybe I should see if she wants the painting back. But really, she has had her curiosity piqued by Mrs Lancaster and wants to investigate what has happened to this woman. And that's what really starts the investigations of the novel. So before we get to the characters and the plot and the adaptations, as we always do, let's look at some of the social change. And as we commented on in Endless Night, that was less an obvious novel of the 60s, like some of the prior ones that were very much concerned with Chelsea hipsters. But there's a lot of social change documented in this novel. And bear in mind that Agatha Christie herself is in her late 70s when she's writing this, so maybe the subject of old ladies in nursing homes is very much on her mind. And there is a social problem of what to do with old ladies, because obviously when Agatha Christie started writing in the early 20s, they would have lived in lavish country houses and had paid companions. But times have changed, right? Those country houses no longer exist, and nor do the fortunes to fund them. This is a quotation from the novel. The days are past when Aunt Elizabeth, Aunt Ada, and the rest of them lived unhappily in the homes where they had lived for many years previously, looked after by devoted, if sometimes somewhat tyrannical, old servants. Both sides were thoroughly satisfied with the arrangement. Or there were the innumerable poor relations, indigent nieces, semi-idiotic spinster cousins, all yearning for a good home with 3 good meals a day and a nice bedroom. Supply and demand complemented each other and all was well. But of course, now you have to be in a nursing home. There's also, I think, the fact that the nursing homes are themselves converted from the country houses. And I think over the years, particularly since World War II, we've seen another number of country house conversions. We saw they do it with Mirror, the country house sort of converted into a reform school. We've had them converted into normal schools, into government offices, and here into a nursing home, which is still very much the case in England today. Other little signs of change. No one wants the cameos or the first stole that Aunt Ada leaves because they're rather out of fashion. We also have, I thought it was hilarious, this idea of forwarding addresses at hotels. When Tuppence is trying to find the mysterious Mrs. Johnson, she inquires at the hotel she was staying with. And this idea that hotels would have forwarded your mail to your next stop, I think, is very anachronistic. Not anachronistic, it's very of its time, but surprising to us now. We have a little misogyny, the idea that men would deal with the lawyers and lawyers would take inquiries more seriously if from a man. So at one point, Tuppence needs to get some information from her lawyer and she gets Tommy to do it because she knows he'll get more answers. We have what's been a continuing theme in the 1960s, which is the development of council houses, as we say in the UK. That's government funded social housing. Here's a quotation. There were 6 council houses at the end of the village street looking slightly self-conscious. And I think that's probably true. If you've got a very old, weathered English village and then you just plonk on 6 council houses, they probably do look a little bit of an eyesore. And I think most interestingly in this novel, we have a lot of discussion about transport. And I've been thinking a lot about, the 1920s novels where everyone zips around on trains. And, motor cars are very unusual. Bundle Brent has one, which she drives very recklessly, but that's because she's very rich and an aristocrat. There's no concept of mainstream driving. And yet, by the time we get to the Hollow, suburban motoring is very common. And now we are in the era of the motorway. And we are also in the era of train tracks closing. So here's the first mention of motorways in Agatha Christie. I don't know that it matters very much. People who drive down these lanes aren't usually trying to get anywhere in particular. People who are keep to the main roads. Dreadful, he added again. Especially the new motorway. At least I think so. The noise and the speed and the reckless driving. Oh well, pay no attention to me. I'm a crusty old fellow. You'd never guess what I'm doing here, he went on. So motorway, when you read it, is capitalised. It's a bit like the first time we hear of a supermarket in Agatha Christie with a capital S. But this is also the period after Dr. Beeching. And for those of you not familiar, there was a very famous report in England in the early 60s, 1963, I believe, where Dr. Beeching identified over 2,000 railway stations and 5,000 miles of railway line that he said should be closed. Because in those days, the railways were nationalised. So he's like, this is so wasteful to have these unused railway stations because people are now taking the car. Ironically, railways are now becoming renationalised in part in the UK. Here's a little quotation from the novel. But you know what railways are nowadays. They've pulled down half the stations. And the next one we went through was all torn down and grass growing over the platforms and no name board or anything. And this is relevant because what Tuppence is trying to do in this novel is identify a house that's shown in the painting that Aunt Ada received from Mrs Lancaster. And it's a beautiful country house on a river. And Tuppence is convinced she's seen it. So she goes back through her diaries and tries to figure out which were the railway journeys where I might have seen this from the window. A little bit like 4:15 from Paddington. And by process of elimination, tries to take a train to see it, but then realizes obviously she's going to have to transfer to car to go through country lanes and figure out more precisely where the house is. But yes, very much a book that shows the social change in England from the era of no cars to cars as an aristocratic toy to mainstream motoring and the decline of the motorway. Okay, so now let's turn to the events of the time. As I said, this was published in November 1968. So what would have been in the minds of readers as they got their Christie for Christmas? Well, it's probably relevant to talk a little bit about the Moors murders, which took place in Britain between 1963 and 1965 and would very much have been in the public consciousness. These were a series of child killings committed by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley around Manchester. Their victims were children. Some of them were sexually assaulted. It's really horrific. They were very famous even in my childhood because they were still, or Myra Hindley was in prison. And every time she'd come up for probation and to be maybe early released, it would be a huge thing in the tabloid press. So just worth sort of having that in the back of your mind. More recently, in the time of the writing of this novel, November 1967, US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara announces his resignation to become president of the World Bank. December 1967, The Concorde supersonic airliner is unveiled in Toulouse, France. I was very fortunate because I had an uncle who worked at British Airways and so got very reduced last minute staff rates to travel once on the Concorde. One of the most amazing experiences of my life. Also, December 67, the iconic film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is released, starring Sidney Poitier, Katharine Hepburn, about a very waspy white woman bringing home her black boyfriend for dinner. March 1968, we have the My Lai massacre in the Vietnam War, one of the very sort of iconic moments, but doesn't become public until November 1969 and really helps turn the tide of opinion on Vietnam. We also have Robert F. Kennedy Sr., the original, entering the race for the Democratic Party presidential nomination. And of course, RFK Jr., now government adjacent, I suppose, in his new post. March also of 1968, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Danny the Red, and 7 other students occupy the administrative offices of the University of Nanterre, setting in motion a chain of events that will lead France to the brink of revolution in May. So this is a period where you have a lot of student protests against war, against conservative values of the elders. Europe is very much roiled by this, continental Europe in particular. So les événements, the events of 1968 is a very big deal. Meanwhile, in Germany, you've got the Baader-Meinhof gang bombing department stores in Frankfurt. We also have, tragically, in April of that year, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In Memphis, with, of course, riots erupting thereafter. In June of that year, the assassination of RFK in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles by Sirhan Sirhan. Conspiracy theorists, insert your stories, go. Also in that month, the horror film Rosemary's Baby premieres in the US, iconic Roman Polanski film starring Mia Farrow. July of that year, technological process, the semiconductor company Intel is founded. July of that year also, Pope Paul VI publishes an encyclical reaffirming the Catholic Church's opposition to artificial birth control, very relevant, I think, for some of the debates going on in the US today. In August of 68, we have the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring is 100% over at this point. It's the largest military operation in Europe since the end of World War II, and I think the end of hopes for reform within the Iron Curtain. And then we have the very famous August 1968 Democratic National Convention, ringed about with protest, anti-Vietnam War protesters. The DNC eventually nominate Hubert Humphrey for president, Edmund Muskie for Veep. They're going to get absolutely stomped upon in that election, absolutely stomped upon. And then in September of that year, showing that civil rights reaches every part of life, the D'Oliveira affair. So if you're a big cricket fan like I am, the Marylebone Cricket Club MCC tour of South Africa, apartheid South Africa, is cancelled when the South Africans refused to accept the presence of Basil D'Oliveira, an absolutely superb cricketer, a Cape coloured in their terminology in our side, or the MCC side. So, my goodness, what a world into which this book was birthed. Incredibly fractious, violent assassinations, youth unrest. And actually, this is rather a throwback book, I feel, in its tone. It's rather bucolic. It's set in a British village. It's rather calm. And I would imagine if you were an elder reader getting this Christie for Christmas, it might have been rather reassuring and rather a comfort read against a backdrop that was really rather vicious. Okay, so let's get into the characters of the book, and we start with Tommy and Tuppence. And as I said, Tommy continues to be the man of action, but he's rather old now. He's a former intelligence officer, still a little bit active. He desperately loves Tuppence, but he is very patronising, as are her children a little bit, about the fact that she goes off on one of her hunches like a little terrier. And he's not much in the novel, it has to be said, at least until the final third. We have Tuppence, our wonderful investigator, who is a little bit down on her heels and zhuzhes herself up with a new case to investigate. We have Albert, the housekeeper, who I always feel is something very much out of Jeeves and Wooster. Sort of man of all trades, right? He's a butler, he's a cook. There's a hilarious, very Jeeves and Woosterish exchange between Tommy and Albert about cooking chicken and the chicken being overcooked. Here's a quotation from Albert, which I don't think is Agatha Christie being racist. I think it's showing the kind of conservative regressiveness of a person like Albert. Of course, some people do eat dinner late, said Albert. I went to Spain once, and believe me, you couldn't get a meal before 10 o'clock. 10 p.m., I ask you. Heathens. Then we have Aunt Ada, who is serially described as a Tartar, which I don't think we would use nowadays. That's a little bit racially insensitive to people from that part of the world. And that is Agatha Christie just having the sort of the racial prejudice of her time. She is an old battle axe. She very much likes Tommy, and she's very sharp. She's very sharp. She is onto the fact that something rather dodgy is going on at the nursing home and makes her feelings clear later on. We have Mrs Lancaster, who is genuinely a brilliantly written character, incredibly spooky, but also quite sort of warm and cuddly as a grandma would be, just with these flashes of kind of weirdness going on. And then we're going to have our investigations take us into a village. And that's where we're going to find this house on the river. And we're going to meet a lot of characters there. So here are some of them. Living in the house, and it's a very weird house because it's sort of been split into two, but rather than renting out the ground floor and the upper floor, it's sort of been split vertically down the middle. So you have the posh, nice bit that faces the river, and then a slightly more sort of down at heel bit that faces the road. And inhabiting the bit that faces the road is Mrs. Alice Perry. And Agatha Christie is very big, isn't she, on the fact that most villages have a woman who knows about herbs and has some folk wisdom. And she refers to Mrs. Alice Perry as a good witch. And she's married to a man called Amos, who we're taken to believe is a little bit simple-minded. He's big, he's strong, but he's not maybe quite all there mentally. He reminds me a little bit, not as extreme as Hodor in Game of Thrones. So they live in the house. The other part of the house is unoccupied, the bit that's been painted in the picture. And again, is very shambolic. It's got nice furnishings, but yes, very disused and spooky. Also in the village, we have Miss Bly, who runs the Boy Scouts, the Women's Institute. She's one of these busybodies who kind of really runs the village. And she used to be secretary to Sir Philip. So Sir Philip Stark is the local aristo, the rich guy. He has a very big, beautiful house. He's an amateur botanist. He's a bit of a recluse. His wife apparently died in the Mediterranean some years ago. He's fond of children but has none of his own. And interestingly, his wife left him during a spate of child murders in the village, which is why I mentioned the Moors murders. I think one of the most brilliant characters in this book is Mrs. Copley, and I think Agatha Christie really enjoyed writing her and probably knew someone exactly like this, so was just doing a straightforward description. This is how she's described by Tuppence in the book. As far as Tuppence was concerned, nothing could have turned out better. It could have been distinguished by a slogan. You want information? We have it. Mrs. Copley was as good as a wireless set or a television. You had only to turn the button and words poured out, accompanied by gestures and lots of facial expression. Not only was her figure like a child's rubber ball, her face might also have been made of India rubber. The various people she was talking about almost came alive in caricature before Tuppence's eyes. There are also people who at various times have been resident in the village. For example, Mr. Boscawen, the artist and ladies' man, who has lately gone to seed. He's the one who actually painted the picture that Mrs. Lancaster gave to Aunt Ada. So he used to come to the village in order to paint. We also know that there was a young woman called Lillian Charrington who studied ballet in London and got into trouble, in inverted commas. So yes, there's a lot going on in this village, a lot of sort of old gossip and scandal that Tuppence is having to unearth to figure out what has happened to Mrs. Lancaster. The book, how was it reviewed at the time? I think contemporary reviewers would say it's very much mid to lower tier Christie, and I would agree. I think it's sort of top of the bottom third, if that makes sense. Here are some contemporary reviews, though. Frances Isles in The Guardian, 1968. This is a thriller, not a detective story, and needless to say, an ingenious and exciting one. But anyone can write a thriller, well, almost anyone, whereas a genuine Agatha Christie could be written by one person only. I think that's actually generous, because I don't think it's really that thrilling, or that much of a thriller. Maurice Richardson in The Observer. Not her best, though it has patches of her cosy euphoria and aura of the sinister. I think that's probably fair. I think the sort of depiction of Mrs. Lancaster and some of the stuff in the village does get very atmospheric, but it's not that strong. And Robert Barnard, who we've quoted very often, said that this novel, quote, begins rather well with a vicious old aunt of Tommy's in a genteel old people's home, but declines rapidly into a welter of half-realised plots and a plethora of those conversations, all too familiar in late Christie, which meander on through irrelevances, repetitions, and inconsequentialities to end nowhere, as if she has sat at the feet of Samuel Beckett. It's a little bit harsh, but I think it is true that these later Christies, where she's no longer typing her or writing her scripts, but is dictating them, are a bit more baggy. They're less concise. They are a bit more rambling, and this is definitely one of them. But I think that the denouement of this novel is genuinely creepy and interesting, so I think that's a little bit harsh. In terms of adaptations, the novel was adapted into a television film in 2006. It's part of the Agatha Christie ITV Marple series, and this is one of the ones with Geraldine McEwen. Even though in the novel it is obviously not a Miss Marple, so much like Endless Night, this is a TV show where they have shoehorned Miss Marple in. It's very different. It's set somewhere in the late 40s and early 50s. You have US Air Force troops turning up in the middle of it, which is really weird. It's all very odd. The broad brushes of the plot are sort of similar. It's notable basically for its casting. We have Greta Scacchi playing Tuppence really well, Anthony Andrews as Tommy. But there's a real irony with this adaptation, which is because it has shoehorned in Miss Marple, it really takes out the role of Tuppence. And so just as everyone at the start of the novel is underestimating Tuppence and doing her down, so does this adaptation, which is really unfortunate. So while it's rather lovely to see Greta Scacchi on screen and it has a very good cast, this is not one of my favourite adaptations at all, and I wouldn't recommend it. So with that, I'm going to leave it there for the spoiler-free part of this episode. Tune in next time for our discussion of another rather weak late-era Agatha Christie Halloween party, which I suspect will be another mini-pod because it isn't very good. And stay tuned after the end credits music for the solution and the clues. So here is the solution of the story. There is a big criminal enterprise in England. Yes, this is how ludicrous this story is. And they at one point had a big safe house where they were sort of hiding and then ferrying on stolen goods. That got raided by the police, so they decided that instead they would have a number of smaller safe houses. And the house in the picture was one of them. And that sort of very nice bit at the front that faces the river was a safe house that was at some point abandoned. And it has lots of sort of secret, intricate sort of chambers that can click on to reveal parts of the house. The person who was involved in these criminal enterprises was the young ballet dancer Lillian, who did get pregnant, and I think we're taken to understand had a backstreet abortion, which meant very sadly later she couldn't have children. She grows up to be the wife of Sir Philip Stark, who loves children and doesn't have any, and it is intimated that his wife's inability to conceive sends her mad, and she's the one who has committed the child murders that took place in the village. Eventually, she is gotten rid of by Sir Philip Stark, and he lies and says that his wife died abroad in the Mediterranean, and she is parked in the nursing home. And as we meet her, is an old woman, but still clearly a psychopath, because at the end of the novel, in an incredibly spooky scene in that house, she does try and go for Tuppence and poison her as she had poisoned the other children with milk. And when Tuppence doesn't go for it, she ends up killing herself. So I think the ending is genuinely quite creepy. What are the clues insofar as there are any? Well, I suppose the fact that there are deaths at the nursing home and they are with the same method of poisoning milk. Aunt Ada was kind of on for this, or sort of suspected it was happening, and wrote a letter for Tommy to be opened after her death, which is concealed in a secret compartment of her writing desk. And it turns out, I mean, this is why this is a poor novel, right? That's just the one piece of furniture that Tommy takes from the nursing home. And wouldn't you know it, the butler Albert knows just how to find secret compartments and desks. It's also, sort of fortunate coincidence. In an early good Christie's, you would never have relied on stuff like that. A better clue is how when Tuppence is inquiring about renting the house, all the estate agents in the surrounding villages seem to be putting her off. And yes, estate agents are known to be incompetent and hated, but the fact that they're all putting her off so persistently is of itself a clue. Another clue is that the artist's wife, Mrs Boscawen, the sculptress, realizes that the painting has been tampered with and a boat has been added, and it's got the name Water Lily and Lillian Lily Waters. So that's a clue. That's probably a genuine clue. So I think that there are clues. Does the novel play fair? Kind of, but not really. I mean, it's not a puzzle novel. It is more of a sort of tuppence adventure, I guess. It's an unsatisfactory novel. It is lower third Christie, and is it worth reading? Unless you're a massive Tommy and Tuppence fan, I don't think it really is. The highlight for me was the Jeeves and Worsterish interaction between Tommy and Albert, and then the creepy depiction of Mrs Lancaster. At any rate, I hope you've enjoyed the episode and join in next time for Halloween Party. Thank you for listening.